When I was in high school in America, girls were required to wear skirts, just like in most schools in Japan. As a high school student, I was not the kind of girl who liked to wear skirts, and I wanted to understand why this gender-segregated and sexist uniform policy existed. I also wanted to know more about the gender-segregated systems that were in place all around me. So, when I entered college, I decided to study feminism and gender studies, and I ended up learning more about gender systems around the world, as well as my own personal gender. 皆さん、こんにちは。専修大学国際コミュニケーション学部異文化コミュニケーション学科のトンプキンス、レベッカと申します。今日はジェンダーについて話したいと思います。とりあえず、ジェンダーっていうことは何でしょうか？まずは、ジェンダーを定義すると、性とジェンダーを区別しなければならないです。ジェンダーは何かと考えたら、多分ほとんどの人は、体の、性的な違いと思っているかもしれないですが、実はそれはちょっと違います。簡単に言うと、英語のセックスっていう性は身体の性っていう意味で、それに対してジェンダーの方は社会の場面で見る性別という意味です。身体的な性別、セックスは、通常は医療の場面だけで使う言葉です。日常生活では私たちは、性別について話しているとき、セックスの性別ではなくて、ジェンダーについて話しています。じゃあ、そしたら、ジェンダーは本当に何でしょうか？ジェンダーっていうのは、英語で言うと、gender is the social statuses and meanings assigned to women and men. つまり、ジェンダーの方は社会的な区別です。で、ジェンダーの中にはいろいろなことが入ってあります。ジェンダーの中に3つのことがあって、gender role 性別役割とか、gender identity 性別自認、gender expression 性別表現。これは全部ちょっと定義します。性別役割 gender roles は the cultural expectations assigned to one's sex. So, for example, in Japan, men are expected to work outside the home and make money, while women are expected to take care of children and do housework. That's a gender role. Next is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's private sense of and subjective experience of their own gender. In other words, it's your internal, personal sense of gender. Next is gender expression. Gender expression is the external communication of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyles, behavior, and voice. In other words, it's how we show our gender to others. By the way, 性別は2つしかないでしょうかと考える人はいるかもしれないですね。そういう考えは gender binary と呼ばれています。The gender binary is the idea that there are only two sex genders, male and female. The gender binary system is common all around the world, in part due to European colonialism, which forced European Christian gender norms onto other cultures. However, there are, in fact, many cultures around the world that recognize more than two genders. For example, in North America, indigenous people of North America traditionally had multiple genders. This was different based on each individual Native American group. Now, there's a term called two-spirit people, which refers to Native American cultures that have more than two gender roles in society. Across indigenous North America, some people live their lives as neither men nor women. Some were seen as combining, even transcending, masculine and feminine characteristics. They performed important social roles, held knowledge, led ceremonies, reared children, married, and lived in same-sex relationships. In other words, there are many more cultures with more than two genders around the world today. ところで、身体的な性差についても、二つの性だけであるというわけではないです。それは intersex と呼ばれていることです。Intersex means people who are born with reproductive or sexual anatomy and or chromosome pattern that can't be classified as typically male or female. According to research, around between 0.05 to 1.7% of the global population is born with intersex characteristics. Next, let's talk about gender as a social construct. The important points to remember are that gender has been created by society and is maintained and reproduced through social processes, institutions, and by individuals. Because it is social, that means it can change. We can change it. And, as you may have noticed, social understanding of gender is currently changing rapidly. Next, let's turn back to gender identity and understand the most common forms of gender identity in today's society. First, let's talk about cisgender. Cisgender is a word used to refer to people who are not transgender. In other words, most people in the world are cisgender. Cis means on the same side of. So, people who stay on the same side of the gender identity they were assigned at birth are cisgender. In other words, a person born as female who identifies as a woman is cisgender or a cis woman. Most people in the world, of course, are cisgender. But what about people who don't feel comfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth? ほとんどの人は生まれた時の性別に問題ないと感じているけど、性別に強い違和感を感じて性別を変えたいと望む人もいます。このようなことは性別違和と呼ばれています。Gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a sense of unhappiness over the gap between how a person understands their own gender and how their gender is perceived by others. Many, but not all, transgender people experience some form of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is used as a medical term and diagnosis that can allow some trans people to access medical care for transition. So, what does transgender mean? Transgender are people who move away from trans, the gender they were assigned at birth. Transgender people find that their assigned sex and gendered expectations don't match their gender identity. They are women despite having a male body, or they are men despite having a female body. Some trans people have hormonal treatment and or surgery so that their bodies more closely match the sex with which they identify. But what about people who don't have any sense of gender identity? 性別自認していない人はどうでしょうか？それは non-binary と呼ばれています。Non-binary is a word that refers to individuals who identify as neither a man nor a woman, or as a combination of man or woman. Other terms for non-binary include gender fluid, a person whose gender changes from day to day, and agender, which is a person who doesn't experience any gender identity at all. In Japan, the term X-gender was popularized for people who don't experience a gender identity, while the word non-binary is more common in Western countries. Okay, now that we've learned about different gender identities, how does this knowledge affect people in the real world today? Unfortunately, there's a lot of discrimination, 差別, against transgender people and people with non-standard gender identities. Transphobia is a word that means fear and hatred of or discomfort with transgender people. Transphobia may lead to transphobic actions such as violence, harassment, misrepresentation, or exclusion. Forms of transphobic discrimination are also directed at visibly gender non-conforming, non-binary, and intersex people. So it's not only transgender people who experience transphobic violence or discrimination. Unfortunately, violence against transgender people is very common. You might have heard about transgender issues in relation to the so-called bathroom problems. Here's a quote from a documentary in which a transgender man explains his ideas about the so-called toilet problem in Japan. The main point I want you to think about here is that transgender does not equal sex crimes. The conflation equaling transgender with sexual violence is a form of transphobia. And we all need to be careful not to discriminate against transgender people based on wrong ideas about bathroom issues. In order to protect the human rights of everyone, but especially LGBTQ people, we need to resist these anti-trans talking points whenever we see them. Finally, I want to introduce you to some gender diversity around the world. This is a map of cultures with gender diversity. So a map of gender diverse cultures. If you want to know more about cultures with various third genders, please take a look at this map. As you can see, there are cultures all around the world that traditionally and currently recognize more than 2 genders. Please take a look if you have time. Finally, I want to leave you with 3 main points about gender. First, gender is a social system that can restrict and limit our lives, but we can also use gender to express ourselves and work to change society. Second, it's important to recognize and respect gender diversity. Third, don't fall for anti-trans hate. Transgender people simply want to exist in this world and live their lives free of hatred and violence. So, finally, I hope you learned a lot about gender today. If you want to know more, please check out these resources. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions. The field of gender studies is vitally important for gender and sexual minorities, especially transgender and non-binary people. By creating spaces where gender and sexual minorities can learn more about others like them, they can also discover more about their own identities. This helps people to feel less alone and helps them to fight for their own rights. Furthermore, recognition of gender and sexual minorities in society is vital for the creation of a truly equal world. Unfortunately, as you may have heard on the news or social media, Attacks on gender minorities, especially transgender people, are happening all over the world. The topic of transgender rights is a pressing issue in today's world, and it is important to remember that trans rights are human rights, and to protect our transgender family and friends whenever we can. So, please speak out in support of transgender people whenever you hear anti-trans hate speech.